The North Carolina heat baked my driveway. Carlos stood at the front of the pack, his face flushed a violent crimson. He pointed a shaking finger at my chest and screamed that I was making his children homeless. Behind him, an army of aunts, uncles, and cousins shifted awkwardly, clutching moving boxes, dripping with nervous sweat. Carlos grabbed his twin toddlers by their shoulders and shoved them to the front of the crowd. The little girls stumbled, tears streaming down their cheeks, terrified by the shouting. Carlos leaned down, ordering his daughters to ask their auntie why they had to sleep in a car tonight. My jaw clamped shut. I leaned against my front door frame, crossing my arms, and let the silence stretch across the lawn. One by one, the aunts stared at their shoes. I looked past Carlos, scanning my extended family. I told them if they cared so deeply about his housing situation, one of them could hand over the keys to their own property. Because mine was permanently unavailable. They genuinely believed a screaming man and a driveway full of guilt-tripping relatives would break my spirit. They fundamentally misunderstood who they were dealing with. I am 29 years old, and I work 12-hour night shifts as a charge nurse in a Level 1 trauma center. I manage combative addicts, break up brawls, and de-escalate psychotic tantrums before most people have their morning coffee. A theatrical pity party on my front lawn barely registers on my pulse. Carlos thought he was an apex predator. To me, he was just another unruly patient acting out in triage, demanding medication he was never going to receive. My absolute lack of sympathy wasn't sudden. It was forged over 2 decades, culminating 1 month earlier in my own kitchen. I made the mistake of hosting a family barbecue. Carlos arrived uninvited with 3 loud-mouthed friends. He strolled in, grabbed a hand-painted ceramic mug off my shelf, and started flicking his cigarette ashes into it. That mug was the last physical object I had from my biological mother. My chest tightened. I marched across the kitchen, snatched the mug from his hand, and slammed it into the garbage can. Carlos completely snapped. He lunged across the kitchen island and shoved me. My feet slipped, and I crashed backward, my shoulder striking the sharp edge of the counter with a sickening crack. But the real, unforgivable violence happened 10 feet away. My father, Philip, and stepmother, Ellie, were standing right there. They turned their heads and stared blankly at the wall. Ellie practically stepped over me on the floor, demanding I stop causing a scene. She claimed Carlos was just blowing off steam and ordered me to keep the peace. Keep the peace. That was their favorite weapon. They expected me to bleed quietly to keep his fragile ego intact. They broke me in that kitchen, teaching me where I truly stood. Now, standing on my porch exactly 30 days later, my shoulder was healed. I was the one holding the hammer, and the glass house they built around him was about to shatter. Carlos wasn't facing homelessness because of a tragic twist of fate. He was bankrupt because he blew $150,000 on leased luxury trucks, flashy vacations, and garbage crypto investments. When the repo men came for his trucks, his wife packed 2 suitcases and vanished. Instead of hunting for a job to feed his daughters, Carlos posted a weeping video on social media. He called me a cold, blood-sucking monster. He told thousands of strangers that his barren spinster of a sister was hoarding a 4-bedroom house while leaving her nieces to rot in the gutter. My phone exploded within 10 minutes. Ellie and Philip called incessantly. Their voicemails dripped with the same toxic cowardice I'd endured my whole life. They told me I was a single woman who didn't need all that square footage. They begged me to be the bigger person, pack my bags, and surrender the sanctuary I bought with my own night shifts to fix his financial crater. I told them no. Absolutely no. So, Carlos decided to bypass my answer, organizing a fake moving day and bringing his circus of enablers to my front door to force the issue through public humiliation. The driveway was a powder keg of tension. The aunts and cousins glared at me, fully believing the manipulative script Carlos fed them. They pictured me as the greedy villain. I kept my voice low and steady. I stepped off the porch and asked the crowd if Carlos told them how long he planned to stay in my guest rooms. I asked if he mentioned offering a single dollar for rent or groceries. Dead silence blanketed the yard. A cousin in the back row nervously shifted his cardboard box. I raised my voice, demanding to know if Carlos told them we had mutually agreed to this arrangement. More agonizing silence followed. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a stapled stack of printer paper, highlighted in bright yellow. I walked straight up to my aunt and pressed the papers against her chest, forcing her to take them. I announced to the entire driveway that those were printed text messages between me, Ellie, and Philip from 3 days ago. I made sure my voice carried to the back row, stating clearly that I said the word no 3 separate times. I told them under no circumstances would Carlos step foot on my property. My parents knew my answer, and Carlos knew my answer. I looked my aunt dead in the eye and told her she was standing in the heat holding his trash because he lied to her face, using the family as human props to break my boundaries. The realization hit the crowd. My aunt stared at the highlighted words in utter disbelief. The cousin in the back slowly lowered his box onto the asphalt. The elaborate guilt trip was disintegrating in real time. Carlos panicked. His smug expression vanished, replaced by a frantic glare as he searched for another lie. I smiled. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my house keys, and let them jingle in the dead air. I tossed them lightly in my palm and told him fine, he could have the house. Carlos snapped his mouth shut. A nasty, triumphant smirk crawled back onto his face. He puffed out his chest and took a confident step forward, his hand reaching out to claim his prize. I held up my hand, stopping him. I reached behind me, pulled a folded legal document from a small table inside, and snapped it open. I stared into his eyes and explained that this was a legally binding asset transfer agreement. I fed him the most devastating lie of my life with surgical precision. I told him Ellie and Philip agreed to mortgage their retirement home to cover his $150,000 bankruptcy debt. I explained that, if he took my keys right now, the bank would take their house. They would spend their final years destitute in a cramped apartment, all so he could live in my home for free. I held the paper out and uncapped a black pen. Ellie and Philip stood near the edge of the lawn, the color draining from their faces. I looked at Carlos and told him his parents lose everything, but he gets exactly what he wants. I told him to sign the paper, and the keys were his. The entire driveway held its breath. Everyone waited for Carlos to perform the noble refusal. They expected him to declare he would never bankrupt his own parents. But I knew Carlos. I knew the parasite behind his eyes. His gaze locked onto that paper. He didn't cast a single glance toward Ellie or Philip. Wasting zero time on his conscience, he lunged forward and snatched the pen out of my fingers. He snarled, screaming that they were old. They were going to die soon anyway, and they didn't need a house. He claimed it was their job as parents to fix his life. He slapped the document against my aunt's parked car and violently scribbled his signature across the bottom line. A collective gasp ripped through the crowd. Another cousin dropped his cardboard box onto the pavement. I stared at Ellie. Her knees buckled beneath her. She grabbed the sedan's side mirror to stay upright. 22 years of sacrificing my sanity to protect her golden child, and he traded her entire future for a free roof without hesitation. Philip stood rigid beside her, his chest heaving as the illusion of his perfect son shattered right there on my driveway. I stepped forward, calmly pinched the corner of the paper, and pulled it out from under Carlos's hand. My voice dropped to absolute zero. I told him I lied. Carlos froze. I held up the paper, Showing the meaningless text to the crowd, I explained that Mom and Dad agreed to absolutely nothing. There was no mortgage transfer. This was just a blank template printed off the internet. I looked directly into his eyes and told him I just needed Mom and Dad to see the truth. I needed them to see that to him. They were never parents. Just disposable meat shields. The realization hit Carlos like a cinder block. His smug arrogance melted into wild panic. He whipped his head around, searching the faces of his family. Every single person stared back at him with absolute disgust. He had just publicly sold out his own mother and father for a free ride. He lost his audience. He lost his leverage. Carlos unleashed a guttural scream of rage. He hurled the pen at me and charged up the concrete steps, fists clenched, intending to beat the keys out of my hand. I stepped back, bracing for the impact. The impact never reached me. Philip broke from the crowd. With a heartbroken roar, my father slammed his shoulder directly into Carlos's ribcage. The two men crashed hard onto the front lawn. Carlos thrashed wildly, swinging blindly at his own father. Before Carlos could land a solid punch, a piercing wail shattered the neighborhood. Red and blue lights flashed across the driveway. I had called 911 the second I saw the moving trailer turn onto my street. The sirens screamed closer, drowning out Carlos's desperate curses. The trap snapped shut. Two police cruisers jumped the curb. 4 officers sprinted across my lawn, barking commands. They grabbed Carlos, ripped him off Philip, and slammed him face first into the dirt. Carlos thrashed wildly, screaming that he owned the house. The officers wrenched his arms behind his back. The sharp click of steel handcuffs echoed across the yard. They hauled him to his feet. Carlos twisted his neck, his face contorted in venomous rage. He locked eyes with Ellie. Bypassing any pleas for help, he attacked her. He screamed that this was her fault as the officers dragged him toward the squad car. He called her a worthless bitch, claiming she ruined his life, demanding she order the police to let him go. Ellie covered her mouth, choking on a violent sob. She finally heard the absolute truth: her golden child possessed zero love for her. He viewed her strictly as a tool, and the moment she stopped providing, he discarded her. The crowd of enablers scattered. My aunts and cousins scurried back to their vehicles. They shoved their heavy boxes back into their trunks. Their heads hung low, eyes glued to the pavement, terrified of making eye contact. Nobody uttered a single syllable of apology. Car engines sputtered to life, and the convoy of shame backed out of my driveway. Desperate to escape the monster they had spent 2 decades protecting. The 2 little girls stood near the curb, shrieking in terror as the officers shoved their father into the cruiser. A female officer approached Philip with a non-negotiable order. Philip and Ellie needed to take emergency physical custody of the children immediately, or Child Protective Services would take them into state care. Ellie nodded frantically, mascara streaking down her pale cheeks. She rushed over, scooped the crying toddlers into her arms, and buckled them into her sedan, keeping her head ducked in profound shame. Philip lingered by the driver's side door. He stared across the torn-up lawn directly at me. His eyes begged for a single word of comfort, a shred of forgiveness for throwing me to the wolves my entire childhood just to keep his house quiet. I offered absolute silence. I kept my chin raised with a cold, unbroken stare. The time for compromises had expired 20 years ago. I turned my back on him, walked across the porch, and stepped inside the quiet home I bought with my own sweat. I pulled the heavy door shut, and the steel deadbolt slid into place with a permanent crack. Reality caught up to Carlos with brutal speed. He was charged with felony breaking and entering, attempted assault, and child endangerment. A neighbor's security camera captured the entire driveway meltdown, leaving zero room for a defense. 6 weeks later, Carlos stood before a judge, expecting his practiced tears to buy his freedom. Instead, the judge handed him a 3-year sentence in state prison, ordering him to serve a minimum of 18 months, along with mandatory anger management and full restitution. The social fallout hit him just as hard. The footage leaked. His former clients severed ties, and business partners publicly denounced him. He became the town pariah who tried to render his parents homeless. Ellie and Philip reaped the bitter harvest they had planted. With Carlos incarcerated, they had to assume full responsibility for raising his daughters. Their prized suburban house had to be sold. They downsized to a cramped apartment on the industrial side of town to afford basic groceries and Carlos's legal fees. They ultimately got their wish. They gave up their home to fix his life. 7 months passed. I walked out to my mailbox on a crisp morning and pulled out an envelope bearing the stamp of the state correctional facility. The frantic handwriting belonged to Carlos. His final manipulation attempt reeked of the same entitlement that put him behind bars. He complained about his cell and demanded I visit him, claiming our shared blood meant I owed him a second chance. I held the paper in my hands. My pulse stayed perfectly steady. I carried the letter into my home office, turned on my shredder, and fed the unopened envelope straight into the steel teeth. The machine sliced his empty threats into tiny ribbons. I poured myself a cup of coffee and watched the snow fall outside my window. My house shed the toxic weight of their expectations. By Thanksgiving, my dining room vibrated with warmth. I invited 4 fellow emergency room nurses and my mentor surgeon. We spent the day cooking and pouring wine. Laughter echoed off the walls. Nobody policed my tone or asked me to shrink my personality to accommodate a fragile ego. We sat around the table I built, sharing stories of survival. I looked at the faces illuminated by candlelight and recognized my true family. Trust is earned through mutual respect, not a mandatory tax deducted at birth because you share a bloodline. My chosen family treats my home as a sanctuary, not a resource to be plundered. We are conditioned from childhood to believe a shared last name is a permanent contract. Society demands endless forgiveness for the people who share our genetics, telling us to keep the peace and be the bigger person. But achieving true peace requires a brutal audit of your inner circle. Let my survival story serve as a warning. Enablers are just as dangerous as the abusers they protect. The people begging you to keep the peace are actually begging you to absorb the abuse so they don't have to confront the monster at their own dinner table. They will sacrifice your mental health and physical safety to avoid an uncomfortable conversation. Never waste your breath arguing with a narcissist's lies. You cannot defeat their delusions with logic. Instead, use their bottomless greed against them. When you offer them what they demand, but attach a mirror reflecting their monstrous selfishness. They will always take the bait. Give them enough rope, and their blind entitlement will become the noose that strangles their reputation. Carlos proved his true nature the second he believed he could trade his parents' livelihood for a free roof. Finally, you must become comfortable playing the villain in someone else's delusional narrative. Toxic people will always cast you as the antagonist the moment you establish a boundary they cannot cross. Let them cry to the extended family. Your dignity and sanity are worth infinitely more than their fake approval. If protecting your sanctuary makes you the bad guy in their fairy tale, wear that crown proudly. Look closely at the people sitting around your table. Who in your life is aggressively demanding the keys to your peace of mind while bringing absolutely nothing but chaos and disrespect to your doorstep? And more importantly, when are you finally going to change the locks? I am Alexis, and I am completely free. Share this story if you are done being the designated family scapegoat.